Hello, everybody. Welcome to AGO from Home, Artists in the Spotlight. We're here on this lovely sunny afternoon with Carol Condé and Karl Beveridge. Welcome.
Thank you.
And I'd like to also thank you for inviting us and the AGO for allowing it to happen, and also any audience that you can gather for it. Thank you.
Yes, we always have good audience, and we're very happy to see all the audience out there. One day we'll be able to sit in a room together and smell and breathe each other in again.
Someday.
Someday.
Lovely. We are going to talk a bit about plague today, so we'll get into it a little bit later.
Okay.
I want to start by acknowledging the land that the AGO is on as Mississauga of New Credit Territory, as well as the larger Mississauga Nation, the Anishinaabe Nation, including the Odawa and the Ojibwa, and Toronto as being the territory of many nations, including the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat. And I want to also give a shout out to all of the urban Indigenous folks that have called Toronto home since the 1950s. It's quite a large community. There's 90,000 of us here. And yeah, I always think it's all of our home. And I'm also thinking about all of because of some of the topics that we will have today, I'm also thinking about all the Indigenous nations. And this is a personal tribute on my part, not to the AGOs, to all of the Indigenous nations that are currently fighting mining companies or struggling to maintain their waterways or their land for fishing and hunting, maintain their sovereignty and rights in this country. So yeah, I got to acknowledge all that off the top, which fits perfectly with you two and the hard work that you have done over more than 30 years of the artistic practice, collaborating together, both personally and professionally, collaborating with various trade unions, community organizations, in the production of your staged photographic work. And we're going to get into a number of different series that you have created, but I wanted to welcome you and say miigwech for being here.
Yep.
I thought we could start with a bit of our relationship with each other and how that began, but also your relationship with the AGO, which began way before, well, actually the year I was born. Sorry to do this to you. Sorry to do it.
That just says how old we are and how young you are.
I just realized it today when I was going over It's Still Privileged Art.
Oh, yeah.
It's 1976, which is exactly the year I was born. So I was like, oh, it's even more perfect.
Oh, my.
We were meant to be connected.
Yes.
So I'm going to share my screen and get into a bit of images. And if there's anything you want to say to introduce yourselves in your own way, then please do so now.
You want to say anything, Carol?
Nope. I don't know what you want to say, Carl. It's up to you. That's a problem. You got two of us to argue who's going to talk first.
So the AGO Art in the Spotlight is sponsored by the TD Ready Commitment, and they support all of the AGO's talks and performances, and we're very grateful for that as well. We're going to head right into It's Still Privileged Art. 1975, this was created, cartoons and text telling your journey from being formalist artists to politicized art, working in that way. Do you want to say a bit about how this came about? I know you started through taped conversations with each other. Why were you wanting this move and what propelled it?
I think a number of factors. At the time, Carol became involved with the Women's Ad Hoc Committee with Lucy Lippard in the early 70s. And a lot of the discussion was around, and then became our conversation around the competition between the two of us in terms of the art world. And the art world, for instance, when people came to visit our studios, they always came to my studio first, and that sort of thing, just assuming that the male would be the more important artist. So that kind of started the discussion.
I don't know what else could I say about that.
How did that make you feel, Carol?
Well, it was always frustrating, but I think that I was conscious that it was not just me as an individual, but because I was involved with the women's movement, I was very conscious that women weren't always the secondary thought in the curator's mind as to who they would be showing. So I didn't take it personally.
I'm showing some of the cartoons, but they were eventually put into a book that formed the catalog for your exhibition at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And as I remember, it was banned or at least pulled off the shelves as quickly as you put it out.
The catalog or the book that you're showing the images from, yep, they pulled it from the bookshop. Apparently, the excuse they gave was that it used the word fuck in it. I think I can say that online.
Yeah, I do all the time, much to my.
Right, and they used that as the excuse to pull the book out of the AGO store and the exhibition at the time.
And it gives you an idea what we're beginning with the kind of work, the formalist kind of work we were both doing at that moment in time we were together. The work that's up on the wall was a representation or a version of Carl's version, and my trying to get mine up, and there's a curator trying to decide which was going to be shown. So that's the image that's showing up now.
There's also a sense of like competition, right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this notion of the art world, the curator, the power the curator holds, coming in and deciding. There's a real kind of, well, maybe it's not that subtle, but it is subtle in the sense of the way you're critiquing the art world at the time too.
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of the things that we experienced being in New York, and was one of the fortunate things of having gone to New York, was realizing how much the market determined what constituted sort of, good art, or the real value of art. And it was determined through the market. And of course, the market was absolutely hugely and voraciously competitive, and didn't really have anything to do with the meaning of work or the content of the work, but it really had to do with the style and the form of the work. Right.
Yeah, and I think it's still like that to a large extent. There's a lot of artists. I work in Indigenous art, and there's a lot of artists that just aren't looked at because they're not part of the market scene.
That's right. Well, I mean, it's one of the things in Canada, what we developed was the artist run system, which basically gave another entry into the public in that sense, rather than through the market.
But we both did have, before we left from Toronto to go to New York, we both had private dealers here in Toronto, and then went to, how long were we working here? About 2 years before we took off for New York, and lived in Soho for, I don't know how many years.
We lived in New York 8 years.
8 years we lived in Soho. So this image gives you an idea of the discussions that we would be going through, trying to decide what our next experience would be.
And this is beginning to work with the community.
Mm-hmm. And how, in terms of when you moved back to Toronto, I remember you talking about how that was a moment when you thought, okay, we can shift again, like when you came back from New York. What communities did you get involved with right away, and what kinds of, what propelled that?
The thing that propelled it was politics, because when we were in New York, we also became involved with a group called Art and Language, which was publishing a magazine called The Fox, which is partially in that image that's on the screen now. And it was basically a magazine that began a kind of critique of the art world, much as we were just talking about. But also we became politicized in that, and we became involved with.
But we became politicized in New York.
Yeah, in New York. This is in New York.
Sorry.
And anyway, so we became, and we're involved with a Black left-wing organization in New York. And when we came back to Toronto, we got in touch with a left-wing organization in here. And I think one of the important things to understand in terms of our whole trajectory is the role that politics has played in that, in our relationship to the political communities within Toronto and within Canada. And it was through them then that we became, because often, the discussion was around class and politics. And so that led us to say, okay, if we're going to work with the working class, then the way to approach it would be through trade unions, because that's the organization of the working class. And what unions did is they also gave us a kind of institutional base within which to work. In other words, they were able to mediate our relationship to their members.
And what led you to photography? So this work, I think this work is a visualization of what you're talking about, right? The kind of formalist sculpture, then moving into more collective, collaborative creation.
Right. So each of us were working in this case. I was working with stuff, logs on the wall. Carl was making marks on the wall. Then we began to argue with each other, and then we began to actually work things through. And then we began to actually function within a group of people, ideologically understanding the direction that we were both going in. And that's what these images are representing. And so now we're pointing to saying, okay, now that we've gone through this process, we're going to produce work, and now it's your turn to take part in this activity.
So when this show was up at the AGO in 1976, this was pretty shocking, right? That they weren't expecting the shift that you had made in your own practice.
That's right.
Not a bit. They were quite upset, actually, the upper management of the AGO and the board in particular. 4 members resigned from the board in protest. So yeah, it had some effect, but it had, apparently, we only learned this later, it had an effect within the arts community, and particularly the kind of, if you could call it that, the kind of political arts community of the time. It had a sort of impact there. So it also allowed us, when we returned, to make connections with some of those people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because the people we used to know, the more formalist artists, wouldn't talk to us. But anyway.
Well, I was looking at that in terms of the collection when I was doing Toronto Tributes and Tributaries, 1971 to 1989. You know, I could have had a show of minimalist sculpture and abstract art still, you know what I mean? Because it was still quite hot at that time.
Right.
But I was interested less in that to capture the art scene, and much more interested in capturing, like, what are the propositions artists put forward at that time that still carry on today, that we're still kind of addressing or still kind of dealing with. And in this piece, which is one long photography piece, I should have shown an install shot, but it says art is political. And this is a kind of, it's a proposition you gave to the art world at that time, don't you think? And you've carried this through your entire career. How much do you see from this moment to now, like in terms of what has changed in our relationship to this idea of art as political?
I think it's interesting. I think 2 things have happened. I think the first, when we came back to Toronto in 1980, was the beginning of the neoliberal agenda. And even though we were working with unions, what we witnessed over that time, and actually what some of the pieces are about, which we may see in a moment, is about basically the decimation of unions by corporate power under the neoliberal agenda and globalization. And so that was happening. And I think that in turn kind of politicized people. And then what you also saw happening was within culture, a much more political content coming in.
Well, there was more content coming in versus it being more abstract art. I mean, that was the big moment for the art world, is going through that process. And artists who were doing that were beginning to get shows and beginning to get publicity for the kinds of work they were doing in Canada and of course elsewhere, but in Canada that was mainly.
Yeah. So at the same time you saw this kind of rise of the neoliberal global agenda, you had a rise, I think, in a kind of politicized culture through that period.
Yeah. And I think your photography series, you always collaborate with communities in creating them. You create these mise-en-scènes with people in them. This is one that we have in the AGO collection. I think it's the first work that was bought by the AGO of your work. This is No Immediate Threat, 1986. You worked with the nuclear power plant workers in Bruce, right? The Bruce power plant.
That's right. Yeah, we had an intimate connection there. a woman who in the trade union movement we knew quite well, who was also a writer, Catherine McLeod, family worked in the nuclear plant in Kincardine. And she brought us up to help her do a theatrical production on that was called Glow Boys, about nuclear power workers. Yeah. And it was through working with her and then meeting her family and working with her family that we developed this series. Because one of the things is the workers in the industry were very, very conscious about the political opposition to nuclear power, and were very suspicious of anybody from the outside asking any questions. Right. So basically through the family, we were able to have conversations and the text in these images are quotes from the family.
Okay. I'll go through some of them.
Yeah.
I think this whole thing around working, we have this in our community too. We have a lot of workers who work in mines and a lot of people who make their living in things that might not be great for the earth.
Right.
Being Indigenous, you have this split inside of you, but you still have to support yourselves. And there's a real respect you have for these workers, like in this work. How difficult was it to create scenes that kind of represent that, so you're not judgmental, you know what I mean? You're not.
Well, I thought by going through from the idea, sorry for our kitty cat who's meowing because he's talking to us. But going from a small child into like a young boy here in this case into a teenager. So going through history by showing one child growing up and going into an industry would allow us to change the different periods of time and the different representations, in a sense that was what we were intending by this.
Also, what we wanted to do is point to the ideology behind the industry, because that's what begins to influence how workers perceive the work they're doing. And the industry itself kind of continually promoted its concern for workers, its concern for health and safety, et cetera, that it was protective of their interest, so they said. But the most important thing that we realized in doing it is that we were as complicit in that industry as the workers themselves. I mean, particularly living in Toronto, we're 20 kilometers from a nuclear power plant. So we live with it just as the workers work with it. So in a certain sense, you begin to understand the situation they're in is similar to the situation we're in, where we tolerate that kind of industry.
There is a bit of, I would say, feminist content in this work as well. Mm-hmm. Thinking about, macho culture, progress, this idea like we're always moving forward. This is a man's field, but then all of it takes place within the family in this.
Right.
Well, it was a family. Well, that you always play the pun off the nuclear family.
Yes.
That's there. And the role of the women, I mean, yes, there was it's like the mining industry and a lot of those resource industries, this very much a kind of macho industry. I can do it, I can take it, I can go underground, I can go into an unsafe workplace, I can go into a nuclear plant. It has a very macho appeal to it, which is that red image is really about, sort of a gunfight kind of in the workplace.
But because we also were a friend of a woman, in a sense, that got us into the industry and got us at telling the story. So we were continuously telling that story in a sense where the woman is one of the major tellers of the narrator of the story of what she's dealing with.
Do you always generally go through a personal connection in order to come into a community? So for example, this work, Ill Wind, from 2001, we jumped a bunch of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
But this one is interesting because you did it in a different way, right? You did like visual workshops, use theater to get people talking.
Right. In terms of our connection, I mean, what we found was the reason for continually working with the trade union movement is, in a certain sense, we became, in a way, connected to that community on an ongoing basis. And we developed friendships there, and we developed, relationships within the movement, so that, in a certain sense, people began to know who we were within the movement. So when we approached a group like the healthcare workers here, we already had contacts within the movement who would introduce us to the local people who we worked with, and they would know that we came through the movement, so they trusted us to work with us. And it was sort of a kind of, collaboration between, because one of the things we did is we not only would talk to the workers about their issues and their concerns, but we would also explain what happens in the art world and what happens to artists and what the conditions of working as an artist are. And also the importance of culture generally and how important it is to the union movement as well as to, the larger public. In other words, the culture is something that we all should have access to. So in that sense, our relationship with the various communities was through that building those relationships with the union.
These are, in terms of theater, I'm thinking about it as using theater as workshop, and then also your staging is a form of theatrical staging in your work. How do you come into that? Do you have a background in that, or it's an interest?
I think basically we started off obviously as sculptors, and then you move into photography in order to tell the story, especially when you're dealing with real people. And in this case, the people that are in this case are not actors; they're actually the workers themselves playing their parts. So then we would come to them with drawings of what we were talking about in the story. And then they would, have suggestions and that. And then when they would come up to the studio, we would have them pose in these different positions in order to create it. Because at that point, we weren't doing digital cutouts and put in, which is what we can do now. But at that moment, we actually created the theater in our studio itself.
And
So
I think
names that we see on the work is the names of the people who have created
people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think in terms of theater, it came about, one of the things we looked at early on were film stills and things like that in terms of creating an image. Because one of the things that continually challenged us in terms of visualizing these things is how do you find the stories, the symbols, and the means to articulate a content without actually using text. Initially, our earlier work had text and we counterposed text to image. Then gradually we dropped text away and therefore had to find ways to tell stories.
So in this case, the image you've got up, you've got this American corporate guy, and he's a half doctor, and she's putting her hand up against the idea of economics and the charge card, and then the patient in behind. So you've got the nurse, you've got the corporate, the nurse, and the patient. So by creating these symbols, you can then hopefully tell a story that people can read.
So this is the healthcare workers basically stopping privatization of medicine in Canada, or the American style medicine.
I like the subtlety of the 4 direction pin that she's just sitting there on her lapel.
She was actually in the union that they're members of, CUPE. She was their Indigenous representative.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Joanne Webb.
Do you form long-term, do you go back? Do you form long-term relationships with the people?
Yeah, well, Joanne, actually, we've known for quite a while, and she was also, when I was on the board of the Workers' Heritage Center in Hamilton, she was on the board as well. So we've connected over the years, yeah.
It strikes me there's a lot of frustration in these images.
Yeah.
With, one of the things you were aiming at was getting them to talk about what their concerns were with the healthcare system, right? And it's the people who work in it and the people who are dealing with the day-to-day of it that actually would be the best ones to think about how to fix it, eh?
Yeah. Well, the common expression, and you hear it now all the time with frontline workers with the pandemic, is they're basically there to serve people, to take care of people. And what frustrates them is what gets in the way of that. Management saying you have to be more efficient, you can't spend time with the patient, you have to, we're cutting your hours, we're laying you off, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting one with the chef there is around food production, is he used to make everything in the kitchen, and then basically in order to save money, the hospital imported frozen dinners already frozen, and they just put them on trays and heated them and shipped them through the hospital.
So that's the corporate guy at the back with the frozen stuff, and the woman throwing away the pots and pans, and the guy saying, well, what about my skills in my hands, in my hands?
Yep. It's cheaper, but not healthier.
This is it.
Healthcare. Makes no sense to hive these things off from each other. Um, and then salt of the earth, again, this is also health and food related. But here you are thinking, you were working with migrant farm workers in Ontario. And
Mhm.
I think I was reading that on your website that there's 16,000 migrant workers in Ontario a year.
At least probably more than that now.
Yeah, significant population.
Yeah.
And then working with them from Southern Ontario and the United Food and Commercial Workers
Yeah.
for this.
The first image that you've got up there is the way they were brought in and housed. In other words, they didn't even have places to put them. They put them in these movable trailers, and that's where the workers lived in while they were doing the job that they were brought in to do.
Also, you'll notice that in the bottom right corner is a straw doll, which relates to the notion of Mother Earth, who comes up in the subsequent images.
And also maybe a sign of where they're coming from.
Right. Yeah. So this is the opening image of 4 images, and it's the arrival of the migrant workers. And we basically, at the time we did this, the main place that migrant workers came from were Mexico and the Caribbean. Now it's expanded to Southeast Asian, Filipino, et cetera, other workers as well. But at the time, they're predominantly Mexican, and originally were predominantly Caribbean. And has them arriving and the farm owner collecting their passports, because basically the farmer has control of the lives of the migrant workers, and he has the ability to send them back home, et cetera, et cetera. So their lives are really determined very much by the farmer. And in the background there, we have Mother Nature, a character portraying Mother Nature, who's doing the planting. And what we wanted to do is connect the plight of the workers and the exploitation of the workers with the exploitation of the environment through, agribusiness and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
No, but it was also too, one of the problems that came is injuries on work, and anything that was a problem, they just shipped them back home again. So it was like continuous. Here that they're getting the chemicals, and that's what's being shown by the person with rubbing their eyes, and Mother Earth is being, in a sense, in that vapor that she's doing as she's working in the field.
And places like Mexico and other places, they get it on both sides. The ones who travel here, but also the ones who stay home and do it.
Mhm.
Yes,
And we're the consumers of all of that food.
That's right.
no,
Yeah.
no, yeah, we were only dealing with the Canadians.
Yeah.
Of it.
I think about it every time I get vegetables. I
Yeah.
make sure that they weren't produced with chemicals, so that I know that some worker who was taking bananas out of a tree or something is not suffering in this kind of way.
Yeah, we just used actors in this case with the workers, that we didn't actually use the real people.
Because the reason that we use actors quite often, particularly in certain circumstances, is the vulnerability of the workers to management. In other words, we wouldn't want to put any worker at jeopardy.
And they're, yeah, so.
So we use actors. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a ethical thing.
Right. So this is around harvesting the fruit in the Niagara region. And of course, what that means is not only the pesticides, residue, and that sort of thing, but accidents actually falling, different kinds of workplace accidents, getting caught in machinery, et cetera, et cetera.
And then send home.
And then sent home again. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no protection whatsoever.
Yeah. And this is the last shot. And there's a truck speeding past that has commodified Mother Nature. And the workers are returning home after working and providing food in Canada. And it's interesting because a lot of them are here 8 months out of the year. People don't realize that. 8 months they spend here, 4 months they spend back home. And yet they have no rights here. And so there's a huge movement now in terms of, that migrant farm workers should have rights of immigration, in other words, so becoming landed immigrants.
Yeah, we traveled around the countryside, photographing the locations and dealing with the union people at that point, getting their stories that we wanted to portray.
And the other touch on this image in particular is not only the commodification of Mother Nature, but the encroachment of suburbia onto farmland, which is
Right.
again now a huge issue in terms of the wetlands in Pickering and things like that
Yep.
with the provincial government.
That's what I was just gonna say, was the, it's beautiful because the horizon line is just peppered with housing. That's all the same.
Suburbia. Suburbia.
Yeah. It prevents it from being kind of a beautiful landscape image that you could, because that is a trend in photography as well, right? To take something really ugly and make it beautiful as a way to bring people into the politics of a place. But you take a very opposite approach, which is, you don't slide along that line. Your images are beautiful, but you don't create beauty of the ugly. Do you know what I
Well,
mean?
we're also trying.
We're not abstract expressionists of the environment,
Yeah, and
not
so
to mention anybody.
we're also trying to, after we've
I'm just,
spent hours arguing with each other what the content will be about the image that we then go out to photograph. How do you show farmland at the same time encroachment of the population? And so you've got to figure out what you're going to photograph in order to capture that concept.
do you guys do your own location scouting?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's our fun thing in the summer. It gets
Yes.
us out of the city. We're going back a bit here.
Yes, you sent me this series as well,
Right.
with the electrical workers.
Yeah.
Haitians and electrical workers. Do you want to speak to this piece?
Okay.
It has a very Star Trek text thing going on in it.
Oh,
that I
right,
find
okay.
fascinating.
I never thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah, the way the text is coming, it makes it feel very
Oh, yes,
kind of
yes, yes.
sci-fi.
I
That's
got
true.
it. I got it.
Well, we were always playing around with, well, how can we do the text?
I know.
And then one of them said, well, hey, since we're doing a set, we can put it right in the set. We did it once.
Yeah.
Anyway,
We didn't do it again.
so
I don't know, it works for this piece to me.
And then also, it was at that moment in time where you didn't know how to burn stuff that much into. Everything was put in the set. Go ahead, Carl.
So what this was is a response to, like I said, when we started working with unions in the 1980s was the beginning of the kind of neoliberal globalization. And this was a response to it in that in the early 80s, there was a thing that came up into kind of corporate literature around what they call team concept. And the idea was, basically the idea was get rid of the union and make the worker loyal to the corporation, which means then you would have control of the workplace and you wouldn't have unions getting in the way. And two things were happening. One was obviously the introduction of technology. And the second was the introduction of what they call Japanese management techniques, which was the thing behind team concept. And what it was is you made each worker the customer for the worker down the line on an assembly line. So basically this idea of team concept is everybody on the line had to work together and ensure quality and efficiency. And so the whole thing is also what the corporations did is they would give prizes to a work team that, was more efficient and speedy than, other workers. But the main thrust behind it was to get rid of unions. And it's really at this point that you begin to see the decimation of unions, which is what this image is about.
Yeah.
Is about, how the union is being sort of torn apart, literally, is what we tried to do in the set. And, trying to respond to basically the drop. And of course, underneath all of this was basically lowering wages and increasing profit.
And also underneath it was the amount of chemicals that were being put out, which this image is showing, the chemicals coming out of the stacks, the chemicals that are in behind her, in a sense, what she's dealing with as a worker. And here it's dealing with the globalization aspect by bringing in different global monies around the image. That's what the structure of this set is. Each of those are different bills from different countries. And I don't know, you could...
Yeah. The thing where the setting we used in this piece was the only television manufacturing plant in Canada, which was originally a Westinghouse, and I think at the time was RCA. And while we were doing this project, it was shut down.
The Canadian one.
The Canadian plant, the only Canadian plant.
Oh, wow.
And basically they shifted production into another kind of production altogether, but they changed the workforce and they reduced the workforce in the process.
And went into much more technical aspect of it.
Yeah. And so the renewable resources here, of course, are the workers.
So if you notice, the people who are missing from the shoes versus the one person who is left as a worker is still working at the project, and others have been dismissed. And
It's
so
kind of, I find it amazing to go back to these works because we're living with the same system still, but you know, having it become so entrenched, it's almost invisible.
Right.
right.
Well, now they've taken the next step and they make everyone a gig worker, right? So you're not even employed full time.
Yeah, I mean, they want that for everyone. Yes.
Everyone is an artist. Yeah.
And this one here is talking about the workers' union and breaking the chains of the workplace and the worker going through the broken chains and all the history of the struggles that they've been through. So otherwise you talk about it.
Yep, no, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now we jump ahead.
Now we're jumping.
Jump ahead.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, thematics in your work return and in
Oh,
different
yeah.
ways,
Oh,
and
yeah.
you know, these are the connections that I see and put things together.
Oh, I know. Still dealing with the same old issues. We're being fucked by the bloody corporates, and workers are the ones who are dealing with it. Okay, so here's another version of it, Carl. Go ahead. This one's done in Toronto, and we actually, that's the photograph down on West Bay Street and down near the Royal York Hotel. I don't know, what do you call it? University. Yeah. And so the struggle and the workers and the police coming back and knocking them down some more. You could talk about it.
Okay, so the image
It's called Liberty Lost.
Liberty
Let me do the title. Liberty Lost G20.
Yeah.
Made in 2010. Now take it away.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, this is basically a representation of the protests against the G20 in Toronto, which
is the Delacroix painting, if you're going to say too.
Yeah, it's based on a Delacroix painting from 1830 of Liberty leading the people on the barricades, something to that effect. And of course, the thing about that was notorious about the protests of the G20 in 2010 was the massive police presence. And it was actually, I think, a rehearsal on the part of the security forces in Canada on controlling protest, and a real test of how they could mobilize the force of the state. It was actually outrageous, the amount of police presence and the brutality of the police during those basically peaceful demonstrations. Of course, and what's also famous about those particular demonstrations, and in the deep background there's a burning police car, is the police actually set their own cars on fire in order to justify their massive presence. And of course, the Black Bloc played into their hands by, breaking a couple store windows, which supposedly gave them even more excuse for the massive force they showed. But anyway, it's based on that, and essentially that massive police presence, and why we have liberty falling down is it is actually the suppression of liberty, or the repression of liberty and freedom. So that's what the piece is about. And the policeman's, the corporate flag has replaced the tricolors of the French flag in the original Delacroix, and we have the police in the air rather than liberty this time.
Yeah. It was a really great demonstration. I remember it even almost identically. I remember it walking down that section of the street, which then we reconstructed into this image.
So in terms of the image, the people in the background were actually we photographed from the demonstration, and we actually know a couple of people among them. And then we used actors in the foreground to restage the actual Delacroix characters. And the police are actually, we documented as well. And we constructed this whole scene. And if anybody knows the actual geography, because that's Bay Street with the old City Hall up at the end, we had to flip the street in order to get the fence on the right side of the image.
So it's not reality. Like for you to walk down.
We won't say what reality is.
Well, this is reality, really.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I was wondering, this is also a moment, I think, that marks a return of protest. Like for a lot of people, there was a time when everybody was being told all the time, like hitting the streets doesn't matter. There are other, I was a part of that generation who was told, that kind of protest doesn't really have an impact.
Mhm.
But also part of the generation that did a lot of it. So G20 in particular stands out in the country as a whole in terms of how many people showed up, the kinds of activities that were happening, the kind of a real kind of last stand kind of feeling, like people were ready to stand there, and also a little bit of a utopian sense I felt as
Right.
well.
And I think what reinforced what you're talking about is the police presence. People suddenly realize, oh boy, the this is serious. You know, mobilizing that kind of counterforce was a signal that things are not good.
I know, because you mostly often think when you say police, you think of them actually going after somebody who has hurt somebody or who is, robbed somebody or whatever. But when you're on demonstrations, you actually see them as a different grouping of people who are continuously knocking you down or stopping you from moving forward in the struggle that you're doing to change society. And you see them totally differently than you do when you
Well,
read
it depends
something.
who you are, because if you're Black and
Yeah.
Indigenous, you probably
You
always
probably
see them that way.
always see them. You're right. You're right. You're right.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that when I was looking at this for this talk, thinking about it from now, right? And
Yeah.
now such a widespread understanding of, a more wide, I shouldn't say widespread. We're hoping that there will be more of a widespread understanding of the relationship between the police, the state, and the corporation.
Yeah.
Right.
And that kind of triangle of power and what it actually what it actually does,
Who they're actually protecting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
Indigenous people know this from the very beginning with the RCMP,
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
and have known it, for hundreds of years. And I think now it might be possible for every Canadian to understand that relationship
Right.
more.
Hopefully.
Thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, and how much work that has done to bring this to light.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's the G20 where the capital, the world leaders in the capital kind of went hand in hand with the police brutality that really woke people up.
Right.
I heard recently that they're actually giving out, like, it seemed like pain money or something to people who were hurt during the protests. I saw an email fly by me and I didn't get a chance to look at it very well, but I heard there's some kind of way you can appeal or do something if you were hurt during the protest by the police.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think you're right. There was some kind of settlement to
Yeah.
some class action. Yeah.
Because their brutality.
Yeah.
Um,
Particularly the people who were caught in the kettling.
yeah. What is your kind of favorite memory of this moment? Maybe not of the photo, but of the event itself, the protest itself.
Well, it was the corner of Queen and Spadina. And that's where basically the kettling was, but also where the burnt police cars were. And that was the
Not the image.
You're
not talking.
No, the image just no. I'm talking about that moment at Queen and Bathurst, Spadina, because that's where you really had the sense of the confrontation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I saw that too. Carol, come on.
What?
Oh, what was your moment? When you went with the dog over.
What did I do? What did I do?
No.
I was just thinking about your memory.
I almost got kettled, with the dog. Yeah. Anyway.
Your memory from the G20.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
No, it's gone. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is another series from 2002, going back in time a little bit, about the anti-globalization movement. So if we can carry the G20 into is part of this larger kind of movement worldwide.
Well, this was the earlier moment. This was based on the protests in Quebec City around the Summit of the Americas in what year was this piece again?
2002.
2002, right. And we went to Quebec City, as did many, many people, to participate in those protests. And what this piece, I mean, the idea that we had behind this piece is it moves from the demonstration along to a television set and into a studio. And the reason for that is that what you realize is demonstrations are about the media. The demonstrators demonstrate in order to get their message out through the media, basically, about what they're protesting. The media itself tries to portray the protest, and the powers that be try to portray the protest as violent.
Mhm.
And so in some of the earlier images here, you see that transition into, well, through the television into the studio, and then you see the violence, basically of the police.
Yeah, this is the demonstration one.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's
And
where
then it switches here
arms.
into, you can't see it in this image, but there's an edge of a TV screen around it. So in a sense, it's a pan shot of the demonstration and then a zoom out into the studio, which then you
So
get the
then
final
Now
shot.
you get the final shot in this studio where they're constructing it for the politics, for the politicians to be able to put their position forward in the structure here.
I remember when we were protesting uranium mining
Yeah.
and had my neck bike locked to a gate in Port Hope because that's where the uranium goes out to France. And
Flamenco,
that's
yeah.
when
Mexico, yeah.
France was bombing Indonesian waters. And that was what it was. It's like this guy, this worker, and I feel bad for the workers in these plants and things like that because they're the front line dealing with it. But he came at my neck with a saw to cut off the bike lock.
Huh?
And everyone was freaking out. And I'm like, wait, go get the camera. Make sure they take a picture before I save my life. Like that's how important it gets after a while to get the photograph in
Wow.
because they will bury your story without it, right? You won't be able to have a story or a voice. But I
Right.
remember looking up at the worker from the plant and saying, after the media got its photograph, you do realize that's my neck. And his face just fell and he threw down the saw and he went home, and I checked in on him afterwards because I was kind of worried about him because I knew he wasn't thinking in the moment, right? He's got a role. We're
Right.
all in our roles and we're no longer kind of human in that moment. So yeah, so when his humanity came back to him, I think he was devastated.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, you know, that plant in Port Hope also processed uranium that went into the Manhattan Project.
Oh, really?
We have to say what the Manhattan Project is
Well,
called.
it was what developed the original bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
Yeah.
Was
Wow.
partly Canadian uranium from, it's covered in the earlier piece, No Immediate Threat. The first image is about Gilbert Labine, who was the head of the mine that mined the uranium that went to Port Hope that was processed for the Manhattan Project.
Oh, good to add this to my history.
Yeah.
So futures.
Okay.
This was 2000 and sorry, I have it written down. No, I don't. I forget. 2010,
Yeah. 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 So, no, 2013.
13.
Lucky number. So this is, I mean, we were trying to figure out how do we do something about the environment and the choices that face us. And as we often do, we look at sort of older paintings and different things. And we looked at what are known as altarpieces that were done in the 14th and 15th century. And what they do is in the center panel, they usually depict the present day. And then on either side, they portray heaven and hell. Right. What will happen?
Or future and dystopia.
Well, that's what we interpreted.
That's true.
we turn that into utopias and dystopias in terms of the environment. But I mean, so in the center, basically, we have the rape of Mother Nature in a mall
By the capitalist.
by a capitalist. And then on either side, we have the same characters playing out a scenario. On the left side would be the utopian or a basically sustainable society. And on the left is a dystopia, or basically what's going to happen if we don't change the way we're living. And the mall is burning down. So I had great fun burning down Walmart.
Walmart, yes. Oh gosh.
Oh,
No, on the one side, the tree is obviously full of apples and green, and then the middle it's leafless, and then in the other side is burning. So you go from the same with the mall across the thing, and then each of the characters, in a sense, is displayed differently, and so yeah.
So in the background of the utopia, we have the corporate figure being re-educated.
as he sits in the grass
Right. Yeah.
with his coat off.
That's it.
Yeah.
But
Wind
also,
turbines. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
there's different economies going on here too, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So, we move from the limo, the corporate limo, to the bicycle. And here it's the burnt out wreck of a car. So we take each of the elements and translate it into different futures.
And you have the co-op in the future in the wind farm.
This is
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the dog playing with his robot. But anyway.
I like your future better than the one I'm staring at right now.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, we move to the plague. And these are a series of works where you're kind of you've moved into the more digital collage.
Yeah, pretty well. We did a gradual transition from doing everything in a studio on a set and all the actors, and it was all done in one photograph. So all the props and cut-ins and everything were actually on the set. Then obviously we moved into digital around about 1999, 2000, but we still use sets up until probably about 2007 when we did the piece that's behind you, The Fall of Water. And it was the first completely digital piece. Yeah. And then most of the pieces since then have been using locations, but reconstructing the locations. Like this is the Toronto airport, but it's totally reconstructed for the scene here. And the scene here is a response to the 2008 financial crisis. So we have the corporate follies in the middle, representing various kinds of interest. The African, blood diamond trade. We have China in there entering the market. We have, people working deals. We have, the government pocketing money for corporations, the government washing their hands, the media sort of interviewing the government, and obviously a corporate figure playing the fiddle and rolling the dice. And then through this scene, we have the plague of the frogs, which is both the biblical plague of the frogs, but also frogs are an indicator species around the environment. So it's about the destruction of the environment through our kind of financial shenanigans. And then on the left side, we have a history of kind of capitalist crises going from, the various crises in Europe from the Medicis up until I think in the 1720s, there was a major crisis in Holland, and then the tea bubble in the 1830s, I think it was, when there was a major crisis on the stock market.
It's a fairly large image, so that you wouldn't be able to tell this on your computer, but way at the back. So we start with the different costuming in order to create this period's time. So that, okay, go ahead, Carl.
And then the Great Depression in the 1930s. Then in the center behind the corporate types, we have the economists and the philosophers. So we have Milton Friedman with a submachine gun charging forward. We have Karl Marx, we have Keynes, and then we have the environmentalists, Darwin, Rachel Carson, etc.
In
the center, right? And then we have
the right, yeah.
On the right side, we have the people who pay the consequences for this.
Right.
And in place of the flight schedule, we have the stock market on the screen there. Yeah.
So we would go into locations like that and photograph the whole scene. I mean, we spend like a couple of months arguing with each other as to how to do. Discussing, Carl, how to present this information that we've now got in pages and pages of stuff. And so we would need, in this case, we used a hell of a lot of actors in order to get the concept across as to what we were trying to say, but only if you see it in a very large image do you get to get to see what the story is.
Yeah, you've got the tar sand signs in the back,
Yep.
green
Yeah.
jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
It's full of information.
yeah, but
Yeah.
it's a testament to what visuality can do and say, right, in one image.
Right.
And then
Versus
it,
it could
Philip
take
Condé
a
mentioned,
novel or a huge book, many books
Yeah.
to say.
You were saying,
no, it's okay.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, as Philip Condé said, there are two Indians there.
where is that? I can't see them.
Sarah Dollywall and Philip
Oh,
Condé.
yes, yes, yes.
Yes, she's has fainted into his arms.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Do you have how do you choose the folks who are going to be in it?
Well, I
Choose your
probably,
friends in reality, and then we look for ones who actually visually can represent whatever it is. Like, so if it's a specific nationality, some people are, but they look very wasp and looking. So you look for people who have a closer look to what is considered to be the classic look a nationality. So it's some of that. Yeah.
no, yeah, we do typecast people. Like we select our corporate figures very carefully. They have to be shiny.
Oh, stop it, Carl.
Well, I mean, it's got to be able to read. Like,
Yeah.
it's got to be able to read it right away.
Yeah.
How it functions.
But it's mostly, you can recognize probably many of the characters who are in there.
Yep.
I see Dot. Yeah, I can see
Yes.
lots of people.
Our friends. Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of our larger community, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
I was thinking about the financial follies, as you call them. What do you think about that in terms of the current climate that we're in under COVID? Do you think we've learned anything about what this photograph is about?
I hate to say it, but probably not. The powers that be have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and they'll probably try to get past the pandemic and say, well, we really were great in solving it. Look, we got the vaccine in a year. Aren't we really good? We should just keep going. That's my fear. There is talk that there will be some changes, and there probably will, but I don't know if it'll be positive in terms of people, say, working at home, whether that'll be a good thing or whether it'll intensify the gig economy even further. We'll have to see how that plays out. And it'll be really interesting in terms of, say, particularly our interest in unions. How do you organize people who work at home? That'll be a real challenge.
No, and even your activists, it's very obviously it's a social situation of which you collectively see a way to move forward, and you collectively give each other the confidence to take that position. And it's very difficult in the pandemic to be able to still continue that process to the degree that you did prior to it. And so for capitalists, it's much easier because it's like, I got money, you got money, we're friends,
I mean, one good thing that might come out of it is that with all the attention on frontline workers and the importance and the essential nature of work,
It's the intellectual understanding it. Yeah.
that might lead to a more positive movement in terms of workers' rights and things. We'll have to see.
That's what I hope.
Yeah, I hope that
Oh,
too.
yes, of course.
Oh, and here we go.
Thinking about the Fall of Water. So this was done in 2000. The Fall of Water done in 2007.
Yeah.
It is my backdrop. I lived with this work when I was working at the Hart House.
Oh,
right,
yeah.
I looked at it every day, so
Yeah.
it has a special place in my heart. So, and also, I mean, the crisis of water period is near and dear to me. So
Mhm.
this is a really complex piece.
This is complex.
Yes. To put it
But
mildly.
it took a year to do it. It was a lot of fun doing it, actually. It was one of the
A
more
lot of costumes created in order to do it too. Yes.
Yeah. But actually doing I mean, this is based on the Bruegel painting, The Fall of the Rebel Angels. And basically the composition follows it pretty accurately. And the challenge was translating the Bruegel characters into characters around the politics of water. And it actually worked out it kind of led itself in a certain sense. It was the translation was pretty obvious in a certain sense who the different characters were. Because in the original Bruegel, it was a painting about the Counter-Reformation, and it was the archangels fighting basically the Protestants and who they saw as evil. So basically we turned the archangels into the environmentalists and the Protestants into the abusers of water. I don't know if that says anything about the Protestants, but anyway.
Sorry, all you Protestants out there.
Well, there's a link between capitalism and Protestantism, but anyway.
I know that's what the last three works, actually, the link with Christianity in general is there in your work.
Well,
Even-
part of this because it gives you a language and symbols that you can use that people are familiar with. So that's part of it. But we try to undermine the religious aspect of it. So anyway, the main character, the central character in this is a Bolivian indigenous woman, and we chose her because of the fight for water around Cochabamba, which led to the kind of changes in Bolivia, and they won. Basically, they forced Bechtel out. Then
Yeah, for those who don't know, like they privatized water in Bolivia, turning it into a commodity.
right,
And the people fought back, and Bolivia is largely an indigenous country,
right.
and they won.
Yeah, they won. And it probably laid the groundwork for Evo Morales eventually to come to power. Then on the left side, we have a South Asian woman who represents the fight against the damming of the rivers in the Narmada Valley in India, which has been a huge ongoing struggle in central India. And then on the right side, we have a Canadian, well, just a guy who's fighting for, I guess, water rights in Canada. He's holding a bulrush and fish. And then we have other angels represent various other struggles in Palestine, in indigenous communities, in Black communities, etc., fighting for the rights of water. And then the polluters down, we have all sorts of characters. And they were the fun ones to do.
There's quite a few of them.
So we have an oil, we have the main corporations like Coca-Cola, and we have the water bottle babes down at the bottom because of, companies like Nestle and Coke draining all the aquifers for bottled water, etc. And you can go on and on. There's all sorts of characters here.
It was a fun piece to actually sit down. You'd look at the original image and you'd say, if you put the good guys here and you put the bad guys here and you put this here, and then you start then translating how to say those, like, I don't think we got John Grayson with a toilet seat on his head and toilet paper running. So it's like, then you got to get your friends. And if it was a really horrible shot, you just made sure they didn't have an image where their head was in it. But they'd have to be a very close friend, like Roz is down the bottom being one of the bad guys. So there'd be a very close friend who'd play a bad guy, or a bad woman in this case. But anyway, go ahead, Carl.
We're actually right near the end of our time.
Yeah.
I would like to, and we'll just go through a few images on our way to the, oops. I meant to stop at the end game one.
Okay.
And we could.
There we go.
Yeah, I think it's prescient to talk about this right now.
Yeah. I mean, this was our response to the rise of the right, which has been happening all over, not only Trump in the US, but Erdogan in Turkey and Orland and in Hungary, and Boris Johnson in England, and Modi in India, et cetera, et cetera. And Bolsonaro, one of the worst in Brazil. But anyway, it's about the rise of the right. And so in this image, we stage it as a kind of political theater or political rally. So we have the three kind of political entities that exist within at least, our dog is getting impatient here. So we have the right-wing candidate who has a podium made of a wall, which references kind of Trump indirectly, pretend shooting an immigrant who would be, in this case, probably a Syrian refugee.
So we represent the different podiums and to say that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Then in the middle, we have the kind of neoliberal or liberal politician with the kind of container representing their interest in free trade, trying to get the attention of the corporate figure in the background who's off stage, who's sort of probably the stage manager. and he's playing a chess game, which is why we call it the end game. He's playing a game with the Grim Reaper. And in a certain sense, part of what we're trying to say in this is that the end game for capital is to support the right, the demagogue. In other words, essentially, you end up with fascism as sort of the end game of capital. On the right side, we have a social democrat who's coming to the aid of the immigrant. Behind them, we have the posters that kind of have the slogans of the right, the neoliberal and the social democrat. And then we have the audience responding to and supporting the different candidates, including on the left side, a number of activists who are about to leave the political theater and go out to the streets.
One of them just pointing right at you.
I'm pointing right at you.
What are you gonna do? Who are you gonna be in this scene,
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
as we are all asking ourselves, I hope right now.
right.
who
So-
are we gonna be?
Anything else you would want to ask? Yeah.
Well, no, I thought I interrupted you, so I stopped talking.
All right. No.
We are at the end of our time.
Yeah.
But I also just wanted to say that it's just brilliant how much depth of understanding of the world and its mechanisms and how people operate and how societies operate that goes into a single image that you guys construct. It must take a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of thinking, a lot of care.
Well, we spent probably half of the process, as Carol said, she puts
Arguing.
it arguing, I put it discussing, but yes, and researching. No, we spent a
No,
lot
no.
of time figuring this stuff out and just doing sketches and drawings and mock-ups and whatnot. And often an image like this one, I think probably took us about 6 to 8 months. So we spent a lot of time. Like the one behind you took easily a year. So we spend a lot of time
And
developing
the two
those.
different kinds of personalities that we have. I mean, I'm more onto the visual end and Carl's more onto the intellectual end. So
Okay.
we will argue about that after we get off the computer. but that kind of difference in how to explain a story and whether one is getting their way because they really have it very clearly worked out and the other person is frustrated because it doesn't say it visually the way you want it to read in the end product. So you have those two kinds of personalities working together. And that's, for artists, that's very difficult because you have usually one direction that the artist is working within, and they work within that structure to do it. So it is harder for a couple with different ways of looking at how to describe an image, and then who will get the end game to do it. Sorry, go ahead, Carl.
But that's the positive thing, because then you are able to bring those two elements into
Yeah,
our work.
no.
So, yeah.
And
Or
it's
too,
also-
or too complex for the audience to understand, I don't know.
No, I think it's also a demonstration, like in your practice, like practicing what you preach, you know what I mean? In terms of how you work, not working as these solo individual,
Mhm.
autonomous creators, you're
Right.
engaged in community, you're engaged with each other, and you're engaged in all of the, what is happening to our world today. So we are eternally grateful for the incredibly beautiful, complex images you've been creating for your career. And thank you so much for walking through some of them today.
No, thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you very
And
much.
I don't know how many people turned up, but thank you for turning up.
We will tell you how many people turned up.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good
Okay, thank you,
Thank
dear.
you.
Thank you.
go out
Okay.
in the sun.